My name's Ian Green and I'm the chairman of the Oxford Civic Society. The topic for the presentation and discussion this evening is the government's current white paper on planning for the future. The government claims that the proposal will radically reform the planning system to make it simpler, faster, and more predictable. The Oxford Civic Society takes this white paper very seriously. Its planning group and its transport group have reviewed the white paper and have drafted responses to the consultation. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to hear your views on the white paper and your comments on how we have responded in our draft. Following the meeting, we will revise our draft as necessary and we will be submitting it to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government before the deadline, which is October the 29th. If you have comments which you aren't able to make tonight, but you'd like to make later, please let us know. I'll give you an address later on before the deadline, October the 29th. The presentation tonight on the white paper and our draft response will be provided by Peter Thompson. Peter is an ex-chairman of the Society and he's coordinator of our housing group, a member of our planning group and the transport group. And Peter will talk for 10 to 15 minutes. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session until around 8:20. The Q&A will be moderated by Gillian Coates, our vice chair. And we've assembled a group of panelists to help the discussion. Clive Booth, the president of the Society, Tony Joyce, vice president, Peter Thompson, Jim Gerling of the planning group, and I'll be joining the panel as well. I'll shortly invite Peter to start the presentation, but first I should explain a few of tonight's arrangements. In the course of the presentation, please submit your written questions using the chat system. At the end of the presentation, Gillian will take over as moderator and will call on participants who have used the chat system to ask their questions. To get the best experience from this session, we recommend that you turn on speaker view rather than gallery view in your settings. And it's often found on these kinds of Zoom meetings that if you turn off your video, there's less disruption on the whole system. Finally, please note that we will be recording the session so that we can upload it to our website afterwards. I hope that there is no objection to this. Please let us know through the chat system if you do object. So with your anticipation at fever pitch, I'll invite Peter to make his presentation.
Well, this is what we're talking about, the government white paper, Planning for the Future. I thought I'd just explain that none of us are professionals in the development world. The Society is completely voluntary, of course. So this is a view from the grassroots. As Ian has said, the views are a compilation of contributions from the Planning and Transport Group, and the full text in 2 papers can be viewed on the OCS website. They run to about a dozen pages because there are 24 specific proposals contained in the white paper and about 35 questions that we've answered. And then we've provided about 5 pages of observations in a narrative response. So obviously this evening, I'm not going to talk about every one of those or we'd be here until midnight. The objectives of the white paper seem to be to simplify the planning system, to accelerate development, and the priority seems to be to deliver 300,000 homes per year for the next 20 years. That is put forward as the fundamental reason why the planning system needs review. Going quickly just through what the proposals are. The idea is that the current form of local plans would be scrapped. The Oxford local plan at the moment runs to 60+ policies. They would be dumped, and instead the local plan would simply comprise zoning of the local authority area according to 3 categories: growth, renewal, and protected. There'd be the option of having within the system neighbourhood plans and design guides, and there's an emphasis on moving towards map-based plans rather than text, and greatly increased use of digital technology with a 30-month time limit for preparation. The idea is that one of the most controversial issues, the assessment of the housing need in each local authority, would be set nationally according to a government-imposed standard algorithm. There would be effectively a tax, an infrastructure levy imposed. The idea is that there would be automatic planning consent in growth areas and automatic consent to pre-approved types in the other two areas, in renewal and protected areas. In other words, it would be much easier to get development approval to a particular project if you design something that fits the template put forward in the local plans. But the local plans, apart from zoning, would not necessarily have any further detail. There'd be no public consultation on applications, that is for development control. The duty to cooperate would be abolished. And there's this rather nebulous claim that they want to embed national leadership. I think there's a few fundamental points about this. Firstly, what is the purpose of the planning system? We feel that the purpose is actually to encourage the creation of attractive human habitat, of the built environment for people and communities to grow up in, to facilitate the functioning of the economy, but above all to protect the environment, especially since we now have a climate change emergency. The purpose of the planning system, we believe, is not just to tick boxes on national housing numbers. I think it's worth making the point too that the planning system doesn't actually deliver any housing. It sets the framework in which the housing is delivered by the market. There was a government green paper about 3 years ago, which actually admitted that the housing market is broken, i.e. not enough houses were being built. And this seems to be a response to that conclusion. However, we feel that the housing market may well be broken. In fact, it may be questionable whether the market is actually the most effective mechanism for delivering the kind of housing we need, particularly affordable housing at all. And if you're interested in further analysis of this situation, I'd really recommend the book, The Property Lobby by Bob Colnut, who is a member of the Civic Society and a member of our housing group. Finally, as a fundamental, I'd point out that the current system involves careful balancing of the compromises between environmental, social, and economic effects. And we really question whether this can be reduced to rubber stamping development proposals according to some pattern book approach. The white paper makes a lot of encouraging what it calls building beautiful. I don't like the grammar. Of course, applying zones to administrative areas does nothing to encourage good design at all. And with automatic type approval to applications, the only way that beautiful building is going to be achieved is through detailed design guides or codes. But as I say here, every site is unique, and Oxford, as an example, has 18 conservation areas, each of which is, I understand, intended ultimately to have a detailed character assessment for it, because they're all different. Of course, there are major development sites as well, like the Centre West area around the station, Oxpens, Osney Mead. There's Oxford North, which is getting going at the moment, and there's the Radcliffe Observatory Quarter. All of these areas have very different characters, so we really question whether the introduction of a national generic design guide, which the white paper hints at, is actually going to produce the kind of result that we would want in our city. And finally, the implication of this is that there's going to be a proliferation of design guides, and there's a big question mark over whether the skills are available not just locally, but in the country. Given that the white paper proposes that the time limit for producing a local plan would be 30 months, we question whether there's enough time allowed for preparation of design guides within that. And there's no mention at all about who's going to pay for it. Going on, of course, as I said earlier, the critical issue we believe is protecting and restoring the environment. And that covers details of building design that I list here, also the kind of green and blue infrastructure surrounding any built development, and above all, the design needs to recognize travel behavior, and increasingly we need to produce designs that encourage active travel, that is walking and cycling, and public transport situations. That means careful consideration of layouts, of the locations of where we build, and how those locations are connected to where people work, where they socialize, and how they connect to each other. So it's absolutely essential to integrate transport planning, yet this white paper makes no mention of it. I've already referred to the abolition of Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy and their replacement with the Infrastructure Levy. The proposal is that the Infrastructure Levy is set by central government and is basically a tax on the completed development value. But it seems, according to the white paper, that this is going to have to pay for quite a lot of peripheral items related to development. The affordable homes that form part of any development, and by affordable, that is only the government's definition of affordable, which we well know in Oxford are not actually affordable by the kind of people that we desperately need to run our hospitals, our schools, etc. The infrastructure levy appears to have to pay for things like schools, medical centres, village halls, etc. A transport infrastructure. Now, if this was somewhere like Freiburg in Germany, that would mean a tram system. Here, I guess it means subsidised buses probably, but at least a road layout that is conducive to the use of public transport and a discouragement of private motor car. And of course, the infrastructure levy is going to have to pay for the implementation of the planning system itself. Now, on the one hand, this could be an opportunity to properly capture the enormous increase in value of land when development consent is granted. But the big issue is at what rate would it be set? There's no clue in the white paper as to where they might position the setting of the infrastructure levy. And another key point is that there's no suggestion that local authorities or local populations would have any hand in setting the local infrastructure levy. There's a lot of talk in the white paper about public engagement, but there is no public engagement in the granting of development consent. As I've indicated already, the proposal is that applications should conform to some kind of template, and so long as they do, they get rubber stamped. So the public engagement is reduced to the making of the local plans, that is the zoning, the preparation of neighbourhood plans, and the preparation of design guides. The government suggests that public engagement will be encouraged by the use of what it calls property technology, or prop tech. As I said before, there'll be an emphasis on map-based information and digital data, the use of social media. They'll abandon things like notices on lampposts to let people know what's going on. we question really whether there is real and widespread public interest in making local plans. Somebody has suggested to me that that anybody's interest in planning issues is inversely proportional to the square of the distance of the development from where they live. And I think it's questionable whether there's going to be widespread interest in becoming involved in the nitty-gritty of developing design guides, for example. We would also question whether digital technology really improves accessibility. The use of social media can no doubt increase awareness of what's going on, so that people know that there is perhaps a consultation ongoing. But trying to contribute meaningfully to something like a master plan for, say, the Oxford North development on a mobile phone or even a 15-inch laptop is completely unrealistic in our view. And finally, of course, the government's track record of introduction of IT systems is pretty appalling, even quite recently. So we have doubts whether the system would even work. At the moment, there's a duty to cooperate between local authorities, such that if a particular local authority cannot accommodate the housing requirement that has been assessed, which is by a kind of government diktat already, in the event that a particular authority can't accommodate all the houses that it is assessed as being needed, there is a duty on the neighbouring authorities to contribute. In the case of Oxford, over the next 20 years, there's an assessed requirement for around 30,000 houses, and there's an agreement that the accommodation within the city is for somewhere under 15,000. I think there are 11,000 houses. So there's a big unmet need, which is being provided by the surrounding authorities who've collectively agreed to providing 15,000 homes. So at the present time, considerably more than half of Oxford's alleged housing requirement is going to be met by the surrounding neighbouring authorities under this legal requirement to cooperate through the duty to cooperate. So the white paper proposes abolishing that. The housing assessment is going to be carried out centrally, allegedly, for every local authority, but how they would propose dealing with a situation like Oxford, where there is simply not enough capacity within the borough to accommodate the houses that are assessed, the white paper is silent. One possibility, of course, would be to adjust the boundaries, which is a hot topic in its own right, and maybe a solution that the government has in mind. But the white paper doesn't give any further clues. So just to conclude, the white paper is full of rhetoric. There's an introduction by the Prime Minister and a foreword by the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, which are full of rhetoric, some of which suggests some good intentions to which one couldn't object. But it's impossible to say whether overall this would be an improvement or not, because there is a huge lack of any detail, as I think I've indicated as I've gone through this presentation. We also feel, as I said right at the outset, that if the housing delivery system through the market is broken, we don't believe that the planning system is the mechanism for fixing it, and we don't believe that it's actually going to deliver the objectives in terms of housing numbers or in terms of simplifying the system that is being claimed. We feel that it is wrong that the priority for the planning system seems to be being moved towards housing delivery rather than environmental considerations and dealing with the climate change crisis. We think that the white paper proposals are unrealistic in terms of the time, money and skills available. There's no discussion of strategic planning, i.e. in the local region, and as I've also said and I've tried to emphasize previously, in transport planning, which is critical to successful development. Overall, the white paper is definitely a move towards creeping centralization and an erosion of local democracy. So we've got a long string of criticisms of it, which we can go on to discuss now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very clear description of the paper that we put together. I think I can say without contradiction that there have been widespread objections along the same lines as we are advocating. And there is a proliferation of activity across all aspects of the community about this white paper. I think there is a lot of resistance to it. I haven't seen anything positive. You can contradict me if you wish. To me, the conclusions in the final slide sum everything up exactly as it is. And I sort of summarized it. It's planning by diktat, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to now open for questions. I'll have a look in the chat. Questions and answers. Okay, at the moment, you can submit your questions if you wish. There's nothing in the chat box at the moment. But perhaps I'll hand back to Ian if he wants to have a few words about this, because at the end of the day, it's his paper. He's the one who will sign it off for us. Ian, would you like to?
Yes, thanks very much. And thanks very much, Peter, for the presentation and for the work of the planning group and the transport group and putting the comments together. It was a very big effort, and I am hoping that we're going to get a lot of comments on them today to know whether, in your view, we are on the right lines or not. It does seem to me that fundamentally the premise of the reform proposals is a misconception. The failure to build new houses across the country is not the result of the planning system, but of market failure. And Peter has stressed that, and I think that's absolutely right. So we could stop our criticism right there. It is simply, the white paper is simply not planning for the future. It's a mechanism that the government wants to use to accelerate housing provision. We don't deny that we need a lot of housing, but we also need a planning system which is fit for purpose. And as Peter has said, there's more to planning than just housing. We want a planning system which is concerned with economic development, particularly in the post-COVID era. Economic recovery is very important. We also want it to fully embrace the environmental issues, and in particular, the climate change emergency has not gone away. It's here, and we need a planning system which fully embraces climate change. And we want it to be a planning system which does everything that it can to ensure inclusive growth, not necessarily growth, inclusive development. So it just seems to me to be missing that entirely. It seems to be, doesn't seem to grasp what modern planning is all about. And this is not just my opinion, it's what's happening across Europe and across a lot of the rest of the world too. And we have moved on from 1947, when the major planning legislation that this is addressed to reform was introduced, and it has developed over the years to be just this: economic, social, environmental, finding ways to bring them all together in a spatial system which provides good places for people to live and work and play in.
Thank you. There are a few questions coming in now. There are a couple of questions about COVID and how Trace is unsuccessful for centralization. I'm not quite sure if that is the sort of question we want to address at the moment. Somebody has said that They don't understand the basis for the assessment of housing need. Can someone address that? That came from Thelma Martin.
Shall I say something about it?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Well, Thelma, for the current Oxford local plan, the housing assessment was done by something called the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, the SHMAR, and in a rare piece of early cooperation between the 5 planning authorities in Oxfordshire, consultants were jointly appointed by the 5 authorities to carry out an assessment in accordance with the government's instructions for the 5 authorities. Now, the SHMAR paper is available on the websites of all the 5 authorities, and if Thelma really wants to know the detail of it, she can read all 188 pages and various tables and graphs and so on. But in essence, for that assessment, the methodology was to extrapolate natural demographic growth, to apply factors relating to economic growth and a factor relating to the unaffordability of housing. Now, certainly in the case of Oxford, I think from memory, out of the 5 authorities, in the case of 4 of them, the overriding factor was the unaffordability. Now, as I indicated in my presentation, there are an enormous number of reasons why housing is unaffordable, and Bob Colnutt's book goes into some of them much better than we can here. But basically, the government has tried to use the planning system to deliver affordable housing, and it fails pretty abysmally to do that. But the recognition is that for any development, the maximum that the local plan policy is likely to be able to achieve is 50% of the total housing numbers will be affordable. That means that if they make an assessment that under the affordability criteria, there is a need for, say, 10,000 homes over the next 20 years, in the local plan, they have to plan for 20,000 houses because only 50% of the total is going to be affordable. So that is how the numbers are generated. But I would say that there's currently a parallel consultation going on about a methodology for assessment of housing numbers. I think I'm right in saying that if that was applied now, there would be an increase in the number that that Oxford requires, quite a substantial increase. But the suggestion in this white paper is that there'd be yet another revision to the methodology and the algorithm that would be applied. And the suggestion is that the algorithm is applied on a national basis by central government to all local authorities.
Okay, thank you, Peter. There's an interesting question from David Clark, and I'll allow him to address it on his own. But, you know, I said when I was summing up that it seemed to be planning by diktat and that there was going to be only centralized decisions. David is asking a question about public involvement. David, would you like to speak?
Well, basically, I don't see anywhere specifically in the document where it says that there will no longer be public involvement. I know they want to have fast track approval for areas where the plan says that you can have new development, but in the protected areas, surely, and particularly the centre of Oxford, it's where the constraints are absolutely incredible and can only be resolved through the democratic process, it seems to me. Take solar panels on front roofs in conservation areas, for example. You know, that there are conflicts between climate change and the preservation and enhancement of the built environment.
Who would like to answer that question? Clive?
Oh, thank you, Gillian. My understanding is indeed that the arrangements for protected areas will be pretty much the same as they are now. In other words, applications will come through as they do now for those places that are in the category of conservation areas and so on. There's a whole string of different areas that come under that category of protected. So I think David is right in the sense that there will still be the chance for public participation in the way that it happens now. What is less clear to me, and other members may have views on this, is exactly what the framework will be for these protected areas. What will the new local plans say about them? What will these design guides say about them? As Peter emphasized, there's a lot of missing detail in this white paper, which makes it really difficult to understand how it would operate on the ground.
Thank you. Anyone else want to follow up on that? No? We did have some questions that were submitted before the session by an individual who I do not have a name for. But he submitted 5 questions, but maybe a couple of them might interest us. He says, our system appears to favour developers and financial institutions who capture the largest part of the uplift in land value, leaving infrastructure and public services neglected. Do other European countries organise matters better? Ian, do you have a view on that, given your...
European countries, yes, certainly. I mean, there are examples. Denmark is particularly good. Copenhagen, they are better at land value. I mean, we've been banging away at this since something like the 1930s, I think, trying to get some system of land value capture organized in the country. And there've been a few experiments and initiatives, but we just don't seem to be able to grasp the nettle. It is interesting in this to speak more warmly about this white paper, that it is possible that the infrastructure levy could be a way of capturing more land value than we do at the moment through the 106 and the community infrastructure levy. But once again, it's a question of the detail. The pricing is going to be central government determined, and there's just not enough information to know whether it's working. But yes, other countries do benefit from this. I mean, it's a complicated situation because most European countries are not nearly as centralized as this country is, and so local authorities, cities have more funds available than ours do under their own control. So that's a fundamental issue that we're not solving. But the answer to the question is yes, other countries can do it better. There is a possibility that this white paper with the infrastructure levy will take us further along the line than we have been able to do over the last maybe 80, 90 years.
In Peter's presentation, he talked about these design codes, and I was interested to see that there's a document that's been put out by an organisation whose name I just don't remember at the moment, who have published a pamphlet which, it's from Place Alliance, and they've published a pamphlet which describes a number of European schemes which cover France, Germany, Netherlands, Scotland and Switzerland. It's probably something people might like to look at when we have this concern about this centralised design plan that the government is thinking about. There is an interesting question that I would like to address to the architect on our panel. It's quite an interesting one from Joan Coleman. I don't know, Joan, would you like to pose your question yourself? Joan? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, yeah.
Okay, would you like to pose your question to the panel?
Well, I just wondered about the design and architecture, what's happening about the originality in design and architecture, whether it's everything is going to be built to a formula. It sounds very boring to me.
This was a point I made, in that the design, there have been some quite successful design guides in various areas that really only cover housing. You're not going to have a design guide for a college building or a schools, hospitals, opera houses. I mean, it's just fanciful to think that you can lay down a design guide for them, and it's not really going to cover great architecture at all. I mean, I think that design guides can just stop really horrible things happening and then tend to make things rather solid and vanilla, really. I mean, there's obviously some kind of design guide at the moment for housing in the Cotswolds, so you get quite a lot of, you've got to set a whole load of rules. So you're right, somebody wants to do something really original and radical, and it's probably not going to fit in with a design guide. But that's rather telling that most of this white paper seems to refer to housing, only housing. And the planning system has got to deal with factories, hospitals, railway stations, sports stadia, all these things. You're not going to have a design guide for all of those. I mean, it's mad, really. Who's going to write these design guides? Prince Charles has had a go at one, but that's yeah.
Ian, yes. Unmute. Ian?
Yes, I was only going to add that I mean, that's precisely the point. I mean, do we have enough people who are able to produce design guides, and will there be adequate participation? This is the stage at which the public, apparently through the white paper, it says that this is the stage at which people will be able to contribute. So there's a lot of work to be done to have, first of all, the designers who can be putting these design guides together, but also, there needs to be very strong mechanisms, not digital mechanisms, but strong mechanisms for enabling people to participate in it. And the question I think that Clive touched on is, how many design guides are we going to have? I mean, we don't want one national one. That would be pretty terrible. We don't want regional ones. The city, our city, is divided into all kinds of character areas, and we need design guides for all of them. In my own small neighborhood in Oxford, we've got a design guide, and that's 50, 60 houses, and we like it very much. I mean, there's just simply not the resources for it. I would just note that if I recollect correctly, at one time the City Council had a city architect and planning officer and a deputy city architect. And we seem to be going on because one of the recommendations in the white paper is that every local authority will have a chief urban, I don't know what to call it, urban design and placemaker, a chief officer. But it seems terribly mechanistic. You put someone like that, I mean, what kind of background, what kind of qualifications does that person have? And you put that person into that position expecting suddenly all these wonderful things to happen. It doesn't happen like that. We're talking about something of a culture change here, which can't be done in the term of this government. That's to say by 2024, which is what the white paper says. It says that all of these things need to be fully implementable by 2024. It's just not possible.
David Clark submitted another question that's quite interesting. He's saying, we are unique in having built up a set of policies such as high buildings, projected view cones and the like in Oxford, which needs to be kept in place. This is the result of a democratic process and the wishes of the people of Oxford. Is this likely to disappear under the conditions of the white paper? Do anybody have any views on that?
Yes, I have.
Yes, thank you. Try and find the image again. Clive. Oh.
Yes, David. One of the few things that the white paper is specific on is that the much reduced local plan will still be able to make conditions relating to things such as overall building heights. And although it doesn't mention view cones specifically, I think that the that particular paragraph gives me the impression that we would still be able to hang on to those things, even if much of the rest of the local plan was dispensed with in its present form. So I think, that, again, there is some reason for those of us who are concerned about protected areas to be, well, not quite so pessimistic as we are about the rest of this white paper.
Thank you.
I think I may have unmuted myself now.
Oh,
Is that
Dermot.
you, Dermot? Hello,
Dermot Rose,
sorry
yes.
about that. What would you like to contribute?
Well, the contribution really is that if we look at what's happened over the last year with the government laying down growth and saying and putting development all over the green belt, because that's growth and that will not be able to be challenged by anyone if now it's been approved by the government, sent in inspectors. And the inspectors, for example, said North Oxford Golf Course was very good for development because it was close to Oxford Parkway railway station. So it's just that housing will not in fact be used by the workers of Oxfordshire, but by London commuters. Of course, nowadays, they're not London commuters, they live in Oxfordshire and use remote working to do it. But the housing, if you look at the rules that are now available in all of Oxfordshire, in terms of development, we have no powers to stop any development in the growth areas. And the preservance, and the other point is, if you're going to have an infrastructure levy, and if it's been a national one, it'll be a very small one, because in the north, there isn't much profit on development to have a big one. And so Oxfordshire will get no benefit from the gain in value, which is enormous in Oxfordshire, and it'll cost us just as much, if not more, than it will with other authorities. And the whole thing is actually a power grab by the Growth Board, and it'll be linked very soon. We'll find that the expressway is part of the development approved by central government, and the local authorities will have no power to do anything about it. Now, we know what happened in South Oxfordshire when they tried to resist building all over the green belt, 30,000 houses on the green belt in South Oxfordshire. And I think that and Jenrick is obviously a man who doesn't actually understand the economics of housing. In fact, no one does, except, I mean, we do, but most commentators think that it's only a matter of telling developers to build, and they will build. We know actually developers only build when there's a market, and the market is very profitable at the moment at the top end, and no one's going to build a so-called social housing unless the government pays for it, and there's no evidence the government will pay for it. It'll be a matter for the developer. They have no interest in it, and the infrastructure levy is simply not going to be big enough. If it's big enough for, if it's going to work in poorer areas of the country, it's not going to produce enough money for us.
Thank you. We've had an interesting question come in from Daniel Scharf. I'm going to let him speak, but it's quite a long question, so I'll just read it out for the moment. Almost all of the images in the working paper show buildings of brick and mortar that have high levels of construction carbon. Will the public readily support buildings of net zero carbon in construction and operation as form follows function? And should the design code focus on urban design rather than individual buildings? Daniel, I'm going to open you up to allow you to speak to us.
Good evening. That was a question carefully and correctly read out by Gillian.
Thank you.
And if you look through the white paper, I find no reference at all to construction carbon, which, as we know, is about 50% of the impact, especially if you include services and infrastructure. And the department, although they invite correspondence before we make our submissions, refuse to answer that question. I hate the expression, but I'm going to use it. It's the elephant in the room. They want to build 300,000 houses a year from now, and it's the next decade where construction carbon will overshoot carbon budgets, not targets, carbon budgets we must talk about. And the government are refusing to address it, although the RICS, the RTPI, RIBA, World and UK Green Building Councils, and the NHBC and the HBF, no, not the HBF, all recognise this as a problem. And the government refused to deal with it because what they say is there's no agreed methodology. The agreed methodology is simply the methodology that reduces construction carbon to 0 in 10 years, but they refuse to address it. Sorry, I answered my own question. Sorry about that.
I think maybe we have an architect on our panel. Maybe he has a view. Jim, would you like to say anything? Unmute. Oh dear, I've unmuted you, I hope. Can you unmute yourself, Jim?
I have done that.
Thank you.
I'm not quite sure whether you're talking about the buildings in the white paper. The thing I thought strange about them is none of them are credited to who they were by or what they are, or whether they're all supposed to be good. But you are right, they do tend to be all rather done in bricks and mortar and look all a bit what they think is lovely. What process is used to press people into doing greener housing is probably more have to be through the building regulations process, I would have thought. Insulation standards and such like. Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm thinking that if you give people the choice, particularly if you then direct them through photographs towards brick and mortar, that's what people will say when the public, if they are engaged, properly engaged, their choices will not be 0 carbon housing. They will be houses with very high carbon embedded. All the examples in the white paper should have been along the green core. I think we know what the green core is. It's in Kingston Bagpues, which are net 0 carbon in construction and in operation. And yet that's, they don't feature, but the government know about it. They visited the site. So all those pictures, I think, are totally inappropriate.
Anything further to say on that, Jim? No? Okay. We've had a...
Gillian,
Peter,
I just comment that I agree entirely with Daniel. I tried in my presentation to indicate that whilst I didn't specifically refer to the illustrations in the white paper, we believe the emphasis of the planning system at the moment should be on environmental issues, not just on ticking the boxes for the number of houses. And I mean, it's not just embedded carbon and carbon in construction, it's things like layouts and transport implications of locations. So, we very strongly believe that there needs to be an emphasis on environmental considerations.
Can I just add, Gillian?
Yes.
There should also be social considerations. At the moment, we pander to privacy. And if we keep building houses where privacy is the ultimate objective, we're just going to die of loneliness. We have to build communities. We have to consider how houses can be sociable in their design. And that's what people care about that. I don't think people care, and they certainly won't come to consensus about appearance. They can come to consensus about things like climate change and about biodiversity and about sociability. And the government are just missing this opportunity.
Anyone else on the panel got a comment on Daniel's question? If not, no. If not, we move on. We've had a question. Well, I suppose it is a question and also a statement from Margaret Madden about the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. So, Margaret, I'm going to let you speak if you'd like to come in. Margaret, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can now, yes.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, I mean, my early learning about the Town and Country Planning Act, which I learned to honour and, well, not obey because I was never an architect, was that it insisted on what I was taught to call holistic planning principles, which is thinking about the points already raised by others, the social, the cultural, the artistic, the aesthetic, the economic, and so on, you know. And it just reminds me that one of the best schools I've ever been to, my field being education, was the one designed in Impington in Cambridgeshire by Martin Gropius, no less, hauled over from the Bauhaus. And would that happen today? I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, do you have a view on that? Jim, do you want to unmute yourself? Seems not to allow me to do it for some reason.
Okay.
You're unmuted. Yes.
And the question was how the planning system takes on board everything. Yes, I mean, this seems to be people deciding. I don't know who's going to decide what is growth, what's renewal, and what's protected. And then, yeah, I mean, there isn't anybody doing an overall plan to take everything into account, including, as you say, transport and all those other issues. It's all a bit trying to get
standardizing things almost, is it?
Yeah, just housing that isn't going to be too awful, and then you can tick it off and it's all right. Yeah.
Yes. So like someone in central government thinks, oh, that looks nice, we'll have all that all around the country. I'm just scanning through the questions here to see if there's anything.
Gillian, could I just make a point to Margaret?
Yes.
In relation to the 1947 Act, I think the biggest erosion of the very good principles in that original Act was the removal, well, really the 1961 Act that related to assessment of land values, that really gave pretty well all of the enhanced value that comes from development consent to the landowner, whereas previously under the original 1947 Act, it was intended that I mean, it was recognized there was going to be a big uplift in value, but that value was available to the local authority to actually provide the kind of infrastructure we've been talking about. That was eroded under the 1961 Act and has not been in place since.
Okay. We haven't had any more questions through, but if I go back to the original list that we had sent by email, and perhaps it's a good way of summing up, the question that's been posed is, what reforms would you make to the planning system, if any? Perhaps we'll start off with Peter on that one. Oh, Tony, you've got your hand up. You haven't said anything. Let's have you in this one. Unmute yourself, please. It won't let me do it. There you are.
Yes, good.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, there are obviously a number of criticisms of the existing system to do with the length of time that it takes for the all the various processes, which I think we feel are necessary, but for them to genuinely work through in a democratic way, when you have got you've got to allow a reasonable time for people to respond as proposals are put forward. I think that one of the statistics that we are really very concerned about, and I think from this point of view, we've got to acknowledge that Oxford on the whole has done, I think, pretty well out of the existing systems. Okay, there may be some things we don't like immensely, but in general, this existing system has, I think, not done us at all too badly. The sort of thing one is worried about is the fact that there are, I think, something like 60 local authorities which have never actually yet got around to producing a local plan under the existing system. And that seems to me to be really a gross neglect by central government in not putting more pressure onto these local authorities to get on with the job they ought to do. I'm sure there are ways of doing that. There may be more funding necessary. Again, on the whole, we're lucky in the city here that our planning departments have been not as well funded as we would like, but at least pretty workably funded for most things. And I think that here, I think the central government has just sat back, let the existing system develop anomalies and unsatisfactory aspects purely because some local authorities were not operating the scheme. And to do nothing for this time, let it get bad, and then say, oh, because it's so bad, we've got to scrap it and do something different, does not seem to me to be what we're looking for from central government.
Okay. Clive, have you got your hand up?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, indeed I have.
Your
Can
hand
you
was
hear me?
up. Yes, I thought so.
Oh, right.
Yes. Yes.
A couple
you,
of
Tony.
things. I do think that the processes that we have at the moment are very, very slow and cumbersome. There's almost a feeling that to produce a local plan, you've got to take about 5 or 6 years over it. My colleagues will probably be, I'm sure they will be better than I am at remembering when the local plan, which has just been approved for Oxford, was first initiated. I should think we're talking about 5 or 6 years, but anyway, I am convinced that there ought to be pressures on the system to deliver more quickly, but without sacrificing the public participation. And of course, it's partly because of the lack of resource available to local authorities and to planning departments that we're in the situation we are. But my big idea, and it's not really a big idea at all, is that there are supposed to be 1 million unused planning consents being held by developers in this country. Why are they not using them? Simple answer, and this is Bob Colnut's thesis, not mine. I defer to him. The reason they're not releasing them is because they release them slowly, and that keeps prices and profits up. So my reform would be that if a consent was not implemented, I mean, now they just have to put a spade in and dig a sod. If it was not completed within, let's say, 2.5 years of the consent being given, that consent would be lost and the land would revert to agricultural use and would be offered to local authorities to purchase at that price. That's my reform.
That's a good one. I'm conscious that we're running out of time. Has anybody got something burning they want to share with us all? If not, we'll move on to Ian, who's going to summarize the discussion and where we go from here. Ian? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. It seems to me that we have a consensus, which is an interesting one, which is that we're all accepting that sustainable land use planning is very complex, and it just can't be simplified in order to realize a housing target, which is what this planning white paper is trying to do. It's far too complex. Of course, the planning legislation that we have currently, it's a bit of a hybrid. The 1947 Act has been changed and modified and tweaked over the years, and it may not be as good as it should be, but it is something which we something which works, as Clive has just pointed out. We do have a lot of planning applications which have been approved and they're not being taken up by the developers. One thing we haven't touched on, though, is not only is the white paper seeming to be a very great oversimplification of what planning is about, but it also seems to be rushed. we have just 12 weeks of a consultation period to replace a planning system which has been in place and which has been evolving since 1947. That doesn't seem very long to have a public discussion. But the other thing which concerns me is that this is being introduced. And remember that the government wants to implement this planning white paper within this government's period of office, which is until 2024. It is being introduced at a time when most local authorities are preoccupied with recovery from COVID-19 or dealing with COVID-19. We may have a whole host of new issues to deal with or issues to deal with on Brexit. And here in Oxfordshire, we have a flurry of much needed strategic planning going on, all of which relies on the duty to cooperate, which is being obstructed by, which would be obstructed by this legislation, which scarcely mentions strategic planning and abolishes the duty to cooperate. And in addition to all of that, there is likely to be a devolution white paper very shortly, which will disrupt the way in which our local authorities work. One possibility being the abolition of the city council and the districts, the unitary county, which won't be Oxfordshire. It'll be bigger than Oxfordshire because that's the government's intention, to have larger shire counties, unitary shire counties. All of this is happening at the same time. This hardly seems to me to be a sensible way to be managing the development process when we're trying to recover from the damage of COVID-19. It's too much all happening at once, and this is a rather unnecessary piece of legislative change. It's ill thought out because it's too simplistic, and it's really not something which local authority planners should be trying to deal with right at this point in time. So I think that's pretty damning of the white paper. And I think what we've said in our comments so far has been pretty much reinforced by many of the comments that we've had tonight. And I think, if anything, what we'd like to do with our response to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government is to strengthen what we've said, to make it just a little bit more pointed. We're not going to be alone in that. There are very many people commenting on it, and the comments are pretty much along those lines. So I'd like to thank everybody who's participated. Thank you so much for the questions that you've given to us today. We've got a note of the questions, and we have got notes of the discussion that we've had. If you would like to add anything, please contact me on the following website, or email rather, info at Oxford Civic Soc, all lowercase one word, .org.uk, info at oxfordcivicsoc.org.uk. We'll be very pleased to hear from you. We'll be putting our final response together in the next week or so. So thank you very much. If by any chance anybody who's on the call is not a member of the Civic Society, but would like to join us and help us to do this kind of thing, please also contact me on that email, and I'll be pleased to get back in touch with you. So thank you so much for participating tonight and for a good discussion. Thank you.